Welcome to Movie Heaven, Movie Hell with me, Simon Aitken, and
I'm Keith Eyles, and we are both independent filmmakers who enjoy talking about movie franchises and associated media. And for this podcast, we are pleased to welcome back a previous guest of ours. We've got on the line our good friend Chris Rogers. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Keith. Hi to you and hi to Simon. Nice for you to invite me back.
Yeah, well, we've had you on a couple of times previous. We've discussed things like Miami Vice and James Bond and various things. And the mission that we've all chose to accept tonight is to try and discuss the Mission Impossible franchise in less than 2 hours, which will be quite a tough mission to pull off. And obviously, we were recording this on the day that the new film, the sixth film in the film franchise Mission Impossible Fallout, actually opens today. So by the time this podcast airs, that will be in the cinemas. But here we are. So, guys, I mean, Mission Impossible, before we get into the films, to talk about sort of the larger franchise, did any of you guys know the TV series prior to the first film coming out in '96?
I only knew it briefly and tangentially. I think I caught one or two episodes in the 1980s, probably on one of the terrestrial channels on repeat somewhere. And it's odd because in a way, looking back on it now with all the history of the films and so on, I think I probably would quite enjoy it because even if you leave aside the links to sort of caper movies and heist movies and things like that, it is the sort of thing I would probably quite like. But oddly enough, at the time, it just didn't really kind of gain much traction with me. I suspect I was probably too seduced by the real kind of shoot 'em up type programs like the A-Team, because that was about the time that I first saw one or two episodes. But as I say, I saw a couple, remember a few scenes, but nothing really kind of hooked me at the time.
Fair enough. And you, Simon?
Oh, I used to watch this a lot when I was a kid. I remember when it was originally seeing it on BBC Two, and then when it was on Channel 4 as well. So it was one of those shows I grew up with, you know, like there's some Battlestar Galactica and Star Trek. So it was one of those shows that would be on about 6 p.m. On a weekday evening, and I used to love it.
No, well, I'm kind of the same story here. I mean, I've got my, I guess, my dad to thank for this one because we watched it on BBC Two, and again, I guess it must have been the early '80s or whatever when I was a kid, and it was something that Dad had enjoyed, I guess, the first time round when it was on, and hadn't seen a lot of them because I don't know how much had been shown in the UK up to that point, but we used to sit down as a family regularly and watch this, and I have to say I really enjoyed it. It's funny looking back now, one of the interesting things about the way that the BBC's, obviously the foreign syndication package that they had, was that they used to actually not screen them in any particular order. And what was interesting about that was, and it wasn't until later years when I caught them on DVD and whatever that I realized this, but because essentially Peter Graves' kind of look never really changed. I mean, he was the guy who played Jim Phelps was this guy, you know, with silvery hair and that he always had sort of side parted and whatever. It made it look like he was picking a different team for the particular mission each week because they'd mix it up a bit. So when you got to, like, by the third season or fourth season, maybe Leonard Nimoy had replaced Martin Landau as the sort of master of disguise character. But so he essentially did the same thing. Paris, which was Nimoy's character, did a similar thing to Roland Hand, who was Lando's character. But because obviously they're quite different physical types and whatever, I used to think it was, he was selecting the right person for that mission. And so it kind of worked really nicely that BBC put them on out of sequence, because it didn't have that repetition that the show had, where he would always pick, from his file, who happened to be the main stars of that particular season. Does that make sense?
Yes, I remember that. Yeah, I remember that indeed.
Let me ask, as the one who's the kind of outsider on the TV series then, because it's good that you two have got that really strong kind of memory of it. What attracted you to it particularly? It's one thing to be brought to a series, but what kept you interested?
Well, I mean, for me, it was a mixture of things. I mean, I found the wonderful theme music by Lalo Schifrin, really hooked me in every week. I love that kind of. I don't know. It always made me. You see the match being lit and the fuse going, and it always sort of drew me in. But also, I mean, I was a fan of all the sort of spy genre stuff anyway. I mean, obviously, as we've discussed in length, big James Bond fan and whatever as a kid, and I kind of this mixed some of those sort of gadget and spy like elements and Cold War elements. It mixed that with the sort of working as a team. So it kind of almost mixed that with the sort of Star Trek thing about everybody working together to solve something. And I mean, quite interestingly, this was released the same year as Star Trek by Desilu Studios. They were trying to get away from the sitcoms and branch out into other TV drama. So of course they had, Star Trek as their sci-fi action show, and they had Mission Impossible as their grounded in the in inverted commas real world show. And I think pretty much while Star Trek was being filmed in the various sound stages on Paramount lot, this stuff was sort of being filmed on the back lot, in posing as Eastern Europe or whatever. But yeah, I just found it really, really intriguing TV and good stories. What about you, Simon?
It's same here. I mean, I was a big, sci-fi fan, and I loved my spy thrillers and stuff. And I enjoyed the show because it wasn't sort of like James Bond, where there's a lot of fighting and stuff. It usually was, they had to think their way out of situations and using, the tricks of the spy trade to complete their mission. It was just, and in characters as well. So, it was something that just sort of brought me back to it time after time. And also, you've got to remember, back in the 80s as well, we only had 4 channels. So.
This is true.
Well, it depends which end of the 80s you're talking about, Simon, actually. But yes,
true, yes.
Right.
Well, we had 3 channels and then 4.
Indeed. I think that's really interesting. And I think also it's interesting looking at the program in terms of both the format, the medium, TV, and also the context of the times in which it was made. And you can see how it would have worked. I mean, Keith's already outlined sort of how that came about in terms of the studio and about playing different markets. But it's also interesting, obviously, in terms of small team dramas or adventures work well on television. They always have, they still do. And also, as I think both said, the nods to the spy genre and the Cold War and things like that, but also taking that kind of resolutely non-violent approach, which is also actually a link back in a way to the Star Trek idea, actually, as you were saying, Keith. And you can read it as a practical issue in terms of the difficulties of actually funding and producing things like that using the technology of the day. But also it's quite obviously making a moral point as well, as Star Trek did as well.
Yeah, and the other thing as well was the whole sort of disguise element to it as well. Because as much as I love Bond never really got in disguise. He might turn up and say, "Hi, I'm somebody else," and then after a little while somebody will go, "No, actually you're James Bond." But the whole sort of the masks and disguises that whole element was great fun. And and I think at the time it was a new element to that kind of storytelling, because I don't think that they might be pretending to be somebody else because they're a spy, but there wouldn't be the whole sort of dressing up and disguising themselves to be somebody else.
Yeah. I mean, it really played on misdirect quite often with that whole thing, and they did it very well for the time, I think.
And of course, the other thing that set it apart was that the beginning of every episode, you got the tape saying, if you choose to, this tape will self-destruct. If you choose this mission, here are your team members. You didn't get that in anything else, and that's the one thing everybody remembers about the show.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point, because thinking about it now, there are dozens and dozens of programs, even then, 40, 50 years ago, that are still known and enjoyed now. But there are very, very few, actually, when you think about it. If you divorce the odd character or a good theme tune like Hawaii Five-0, or general concepts like shooting people and not getting hurt, as you find in the A-Team, there are very, very few American shows from that period that actually have a really, that have really embedded themselves into popular culture in that way. And obviously you could argue that a lot of that was down to the success of the films that we're about to talk about. But I think that's a really interesting point, Simon, that you say that, because also it shows, as Keith was saying, a fairly audacious take on the idea of disguise or dressing up, if you want to put it like that. It's also quite interesting and quite innovative to come up with that introduction as well, because that clearly was different, as you both said. And it was good that it held your attention, even 20 years later, when the product and the availability of stuff, even with 4 channels, had expanded. And it was good. It's really interesting hearing you both sort of say that really worked for you.
Yeah. Well, also it's that Adam that people use, keep it simple.
Yeah.
It's a simple way of setting up the story each week, and it's very efficient.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because if I was going to mention, and perhaps we might come on to this, at how the program influenced other programs that followed. But again, if you think about a couple of those, or ones that were actually around almost at the time, actually, in that respect. So if you think about Thunderbirds, for example, which was pretty much bang on the same year, you've got that brilliant idea of showing you, a 20-second montage of what you're about to enjoy for the next hour, before getting into a really good musical hook, and then taking you through the story. So it's quite interesting, again, that you've got a similar way there on either side of the Atlantic. And of course, Thunderbirds was very much influenced by American things of that period, bringing you in and doing something a bit different.
It was funny how the whole thing with the having to edit new credits for big opening credits for every episode. That sort of became a vogue thing, because Space 1999, that Lando and Bain, who are on this, actually left to do, used a similar sort of format. And then Ron Moore, when he did the reimagining of Battlestar Galactica, decided to take that sort of aesthetic for the intro as well, and show you sort of really brief clips of what's about to come, with no spoilers. So.
Interesting, because at the moment I am partway through watching all of Alias again, and what's interesting about that is, which is, for those who don't know, and there can't be that many, a spy show from the early 2000s, it's interesting that although it was quite innovative in a lot of ways, and particularly when you see the first season, which really holds up well, its opening credits, when it got into its run, were actually incredibly pedestrian, which is kind of interesting, because it's very strong in a lot of other respects. So it's interesting seeing something that, has elements of the Mission Impossible genre. In fact, quite a few elements, actually. Sydney disguising herself every week, albeit not perhaps the extent in MI. But, there are a number of elements that follow through there. So it's interesting to see that, again, 50 years ago, they were doing things a little bit snazzier and a bit cleverer in some ways than we do now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, I always used to describe Alias, which was a show I was a big fan of, but I used to describe it back in the day to people. I said it's sort of Lara Croft meets Mission Impossible, with a bit of a sort of soap drama thing going on as well, so especially in the first couple of seasons. So I mean, and of course, as we will find during our discussion here, that there is a massive link between Alias and the Mission Impossible film franchise. So that's quite a good lead in, actually.
That is a very good point. Just before though, perhaps we could have a quick chat about that. Programs that have been influenced by Mission Impossible, because, and again, I'd be interested to hear your takes, both of you, on this, because as fans of it, some time ago, you will, I think, probably be more alive to it than me. But even from my kind of fairly shallow acquaintance with the series, thinking about this podcast, it was quite interesting, because one program that I did start to get more interested in back in the 80s as a first run show was MacGyver, which of course was very explicitly launched as a non-violent series, not in a kind of, namby-pamby way, but as a genuine alternative to the sort of action stuff that I was obviously a massive fan of. And whilst it didn't have the disguise elements necessary of MI, you obviously had the kind of ingenuity idea and about, non-violent resolution of things, ingenious resolution of things. And again, talking about the A-Team, I think you have to at least suggest that there is a slight nod in the A-Team's famous shed build sequence, preluded the last act, through to MacGyver and through back to Mission Impossible. And again, you can laugh as much as you like, as we all will do and have done, about the endless supply of ammunition that never kills anyone. But it is really interesting when you look at those little ingenuity bits, the little builds. And actually, Hannibal himself often dressed up, completely disguised himself to make a lot of the contact. So I think it is quite interesting. You can actually draw some lines through there. And one thing I do remember is that there was another one of Jerry Anderson's series that I was very much into, was Terrorhawks. And there was a very, very explicit steal from Mission Impossible in one of the episodes there, when the main guy, whose name escapes me, apologies, but the main leader of the Terrorhawks, gets one of Zelda's cronies in what they think is a particular setting, and it turns out that the whole thing was a set inside a movie studio on a back lot somewhere, and it was about to be blown up. So there was a very clear link there to Mission Impossible.
Okay, nice one. Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree with all those comparisons, really, that you've given. I mean, certainly, yes, the A-Team, has, that element where Hannibal, often was seen as a master of disguise, much the same as Roland Hand or Paris was in Mission Impossible. So, there's some definite lines there. And again, a bizarre movie line, I guess, because at one point, Joe Carnahan was attached to do a Mission Impossible movie, but that kind of fell through. And the next film he did was actually his adaptation of the A-Team. So there you go. Everything is connected. It's weird.
It's a very holistic podcast. This is good.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. I will say as well, just one last thing on the TV show, and I appreciate we need to... because our mission counter is ticking, so we need to get onto the film franchise. But when I went back and sort of rewatched some Mission Impossibles when they came out on home media, it did surprise me actually that Jim Phelps, played by Peter Graves, was such a massive sort of character in the series, and I'd always assumed that he was always the MI leader. But actually, the first season featured a different character called Dan Briggs, who was played by Stephen Hill. And interestingly, the setup of that, back on the first season, rather than having the reel-to-reel audio tape recording, it was actually on a vinyl record that would self-destruct, which was something I quite liked when they brought that into the film franchise.
I thought vinyl records self-destruct anyway, even in normal life, frankly.
Oh, there's a lot of vinyl fans out there. But yeah, so I thought that was quite fun. And then the other thing, I don't know whether any of you guys saw this, but Simon often mentions from his VHS days that you used to remember the trailers on the beginning of films that you'd hire or rent out. And I'll never forget, I was really excited about it and never actually saw it, was in the 80s. They did a revival show. Basically, it came about because of the writers' strike in Hollywood, and basically kicked out 2 seasons of a sort of Mission Impossible Continues type show, sort of the next generation of Mission Impossible, which they filmed sort of on the cheap in Australia. And I'll never forget that they actually had an ad for it, which you see Peter Graves light the match and the fuse go, and then it was a montage of all these scenes from this from this series, and it had I recognized it had Anthony Hamilton from Cover Up, and it had Jane Badler from V, and it had all of these sort of TV actors of the time, and it even had the son of Barney Collier from the Greg Morris from the original series and whatever in it, and it ended, and I was like, oh, I really want to see that, and they didn't release it. So it was one of those really annoying things where you'd seen the trailer and never actually got to see the series. So I know it's available now, but at the time it wasn't. Well, it certainly wasn't airing where I grew up in the UK anyway. So, but I remember being quite excited to see it, and I had to wait until the movie series, which we're coming to.
Can I just ask, what do you remember? What VHS the advert was on?
Oh, I've no idea. No idea.
Oh, okay.
It was some. It was probably some low budget action film that Dad had said would be good to watch, and I kind of went along with. But I have no idea. This must have been around, though. I think the television series was produced around 87 or 88, so right. it was somewhere around that point. But and I was like, oh my God, they've redone Mission Impossible, But the next time I saw it redone was in '96 when it was Tom Cruise's franchise. So there you go.
There you go. Yes.
Perfect intro there.
Well, there you have it. But all right then. So, on to the movies, I guess, because that's obviously the main point of this topic. So we are movie heaven, movie hell, after all. I mean, I take it you guys both saw the first movie on the big screen and all the hype leading up to it, right?
Yes.
I definitely saw it on the big screen. I'm not sure, actually. Actually, it's an interesting point about whether there was a lot of hype that I can remember, because it was, in a way, it was a while ago. I mean, it was 20 odd years ago. And I definitely remember seeing it, and I'll happily talk about that and the impact it made on me. But I don't remember it being particularly hyped to the extent that, I thought, wow, I must see that because it's an MI film. And it's interesting because, Cruise was obviously a well-established star by then. I knew of Brian De Palma's work, although, again, I'm not sure I necessarily connect it. And even now, getting my head around it for this, I'm not sure I necessarily connect the two things together, De Palma and the Mission Impossible films, even though he did kick off the whole franchise. But yeah, I definitely saw it on the big screen. And as with all films, and particularly action films, that's an absolute must. It won't quite save a terrible film, but it sure as hell gives a boost to a pretty average one. And I'm not suggesting this is either of those, but yeah, definitely saw it when it came out in the pictures.
Yeah, you got to remember, this came out in the summer of '96, which was a big summer. So you had Independence Day, you had The Rock, you had Twister, and then you had Mission Impossible.
All of which I saw. I remember very clearly all of them.
Yeah, me too.
I remember I went to the cinema quite a lot that summer. But I remember there was a lot of hype about Mission Impossible. I mean, the one image they kept using and they still use for it, is Tom Cruise being suspended over the desk in the safe at the CIA headquarters.
Yeah, which we do need to talk about, not least because that particular sequence has obviously driven the placement of a similar sequence in every single one of the films since.
Yes. Yeah, it's become their internal trope, hasn't it? Yes.
Which is interesting because it's not even original. It wasn't original at the time. And it's interesting that it has received, it is now linked, indelibly to this particular franchise. But yeah, we'll come on to that, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know quite what it had borrowed that from, because I know in Brian De Palma does like to homage other filmmakers and things he's seen, but I don't remember what I would have seen that scene in before.
Well, I would suggest, and it's not an absolute takeoff by any means, but given, as you were saying quite rightly, given De Palma's own work in that particular era and that genre, and genres that are similar, I think it's unlikely that he wasn't aware of a admittedly fairly little known film now called Diamonds, starring Robert Shaw. It was made in 1975,
right.
And it is a heist movie. And their particular mission impossible for that gang was to get across one side of a vault to the other without touching the floor. And they did it by hanging from the ceiling. They didn't do it in the same way, and I won't spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but it was something that I thought of when I watched it, and it came to me again just now. So yeah, it's interesting. I think there are very few things generally that are absolutely unique and new in movies. That is kind of their strength in a way. So I'd be surprised if someone of De Palma's kind of background wasn't at least aware of it.
He probably was. He probably was aware of it, but I think the mainstream audience wouldn't have.
No, I agree.
Hence why it was, such a scene stealer. It's the one thing in the entire film that everybody kind of remembers. I have to say, I remember at the time thinking that some of the deaths in it were quite grisly, especially the death of Emilio Estevez's character.
Yeah, although I think, and it's interesting because, and this again, I think is one of the features of the way a lot of people now consume films, watching them on the telly as opposed to watching them on DVD or on streaming or what have you. And for people of, if I may say, our generation, particularly films you've never seen before, but even ones that you have seen and then forget and you only ever revisit in that format, that scene is almost always cut. From TV screenings. Even Film 4 now cuts films, which it never used to do. So a lot of people will miss that. And depending on how good, stroke bad, the cut is, you won't even get what happened, because sometimes they even cut out where the knives kind of flick out. So, it's quite an interesting one. It's funny you should say that as well, because you're absolutely right to flag that up. And yet, actually, the whole of the rest of the film, and in my view, as we'll no doubt come on to, the whole franchise, until you get halfway through, they steer very much away from violence. Yes, okay, there are cars blowing up and people die off screen and things like that, but it's not the sort of film that you'd expect to see something like that in, and indeed you don't until you get up, in my view, to Mission Impossible 3. So it's interesting, and maybe they decided to do that to give it a bit of a kind of frisson of, something a bit serious.
But again, I think it's just a slight trademark of Brian De Palma, because Brian De Palma does, he does violence. He does explicit violence.
Absolutely.
I mean, his films. I mean, a lot of his films do get cut when they're shown on TV.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's interesting also that the other thing that I think De Palma brings to the film, particularly as it develops, and I think for me this does go back to his kind of neo-noir background, is the atmosphere, because although we've talked about one of the key action scenes, and there are at least two more that I think will stick in people's minds, but actually for me one of the best bits about the film is the atmosphere of the non-action scenes. And in particular, again, and I think for me, it's another one of those, I hate to use the word iconic, so I'm not going to use it, but it's another one of those things that tends to get screenshotted and used quite a bit. The fact that they make their little base in a little Victorian garret off of Liverpool Street Station, and it very clearly is Liverpool Street Station because that's where they shot it. Yeah. There's that lovely scene of Cruise when he walks in the rain across the road to the little arcade entrance, which is still there now, although it probably won't last much longer. And I think it's a very European film, which is another thing that De Palma was quite keen on. This whole idea of mixing American ideas, Central European ideas, that sort of thing. And I think one of the interesting things about the first Mission Impossible film is that most people remember it for the action, and rightly so, but actually there's a huge amount of very European atmosphere in it. And that's something you don't often get with American directed films. And you tend to notice it when it happens.
Yeah. Those phone booths are not there anymore, though, at Liverpool Street Station now.
Yeah, they're not there anywhere. Yeah. So, Keith,
yes.
Getting into spoilers here, but I have to ask you, as a fan of the TV show, what did you think about making Jim Phelps the villain?
Okay, yeah, I mean, that is a point, and I knew we'd get to that. Basically, I'll be honest, I was really excited about this film because, Tom Cruise had done some, good work up to that point. This was obviously the first film he produced as well. And he was clearly, he obviously grew up in the generation where, this was screening when he was a kid. So, he was obviously a big fan of the TV show and wanted to make this extension of it. He was very smart to hire a director like De Palma to do this. Obviously, we've had our podcasts talking specifically about De Palma, but he is a very stylish director, and from a continuity point of view, initially I was upset that Peter Graves wasn't coming back to reprise the role because he was still alive at the time, and obviously they recast him with Jon Voight, and I'd heard that apparently the role was offered to him and he declined on it, right? So obviously when I saw the film and was loving this film all the way through, and then you get to 2/3 of the way through and there's this kind of reveal, I could see why the man that had basically played this role through some sort of 10 seasons of Mission Impossible and had been playing it for 20 years by that point, was a little upset that his character that was essentially the lead, all-American flag-waving leader of the IMF, turned out to be a traitor and turned out to be a traitor for, a fairly weak motivation that obviously the Cold War was now over and the president didn't have to ask his permission anymore. And suddenly he realized he had a failed marriage and 80 grand a year or whatever it was. And this, was the thing that made him sort of decide to commit treason and kill his team. So even though I loved the film, I did kind of have a problem with the whole Jim Phelps thing as a fan of the original series. So yes, is my long-winded answer to that.
I think it's interesting because, of course, even then in the 90s, I mean, that was post the first Gulf War. You can guess, if you wanted to stretch a point a little bit, you could say that was when, Americans started to think about the lack of certainties post Cold War and things like that. So it kind of fits with that. But also, of course, it fits quite well with De Palma and his films, where very often people turn out to be something that you thought they weren't, or vice versa. So I suppose inevitably it's the sort of thing that happens when you bring a director like that to a franchise like that. And, one of your main decisions is, Do you honour it totally, or do you take a few left turns occasionally?
Yeah. I mean, if you lose the connection of Jim Phelps to the TV show, I mean, this is essentially a passing of the gauntlet film anyway. So, they used Phelps as the connection to the source material that Bruce Geller had created, and they obviously it was then going to be Ethan Hunt as the the new leader and the central character and all of this sort of thing. So it is kind of almost like Mission Impossible, the third generation, if you count the 80s show as well. But I mean, I really enjoyed the film, but I had a bit of a problem with them making. I didn't have a problem with John Voight playing him instead of Peter Graves, but I did have a problem with him sort of turning out to be the bad guy. But I didn't see that coming. So the whole reveal thing and everything worked in true De Palma fashion, and it was a real misdirect. And they did so many things right in the film that I can sort of forgive that from a story point of view. The film was a great bit of entertainment, and it's a pretty close homage to the obviously on a much more international and bigger action scale, but it is a fairly good homage to the TV show on which it was based.
Yeah, I would say this was probably the closest to the TV show out of all the films.
Interesting what you said, Keith, about not seeing things coming. I was wondering what you both thought, again, particularly as fans of the original, and given what Simon just said, around perhaps the two other action sequences, one which is relatively small but still pretty good, and obviously the climax. So if you think about the fish tank scene in the restaurant, I, as the outsider, would say that was obviously something that was a little bit closer in scale and kind of feel to the original. Whereas, of course, when you get to the climax in the Channel Tunnel, you have something that is very much not what was
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a tad ridiculous, isn't it, to be fair?
You say that, but I think for me, the very first question was, did we see it on the big screen? And I did. And I remember very clearly that seeing that climax for the first time was really stunning. It really was breathtaking because, yes, part of me must have realised that it was utterly ludicrous because the Channel Tunnel was open by then. It had been open for 3 years, but it looks absolutely nothing like the Channel Tunnel in Mission Impossible in any way. Before you even get into flying helicopters through it. So clearly it's ludicrous in any, reasonable sense. But it really did grab me at the time because it had such kind of chutzpah to it. It was so audacious and you just kind of run with it. And that famous end scene where the sort of chopped up blade stops just pointed to his neck, it is a bloody good scene and it works really well even now.
Yeah, even though you get the train driver.
I was going to not mention that. You spoiled it.
But no, I mean, yes, it is a lot of fun. And I think, that's been the thing. They've obviously tried to outdo, these sort of scenes with each installment. And they've gradually got more realistic in terms of the fact that they're more or less done for real nowadays, whereas obviously that was clearly very fabricated and and it does sort of show, although it works really well, as the tension and everything in it works really well. It is preposterous, though.
I have to say, you can't have a good spy stroke action stroke caper movie without a fight on a train.
This is true, yes.
And you do get a really good fight on a train.
Literally on a train. Yeah,
and that was relatively unusual at the time in the sense that conceptually it's no different to all the James Bond train chases or even World War II set film chases. There are bits that are shot on a real train, on a real track, and there are bits that are shot in a studio. The difference was that you're at the dawn of the digital age, so what would have been back projection in the old days and would have been wholly unconvincing was far more convincing now. And you get your star, you put the fan on them, and you have a digital backdrop, and you can do it a lot more convincingly. And if you remember, there's the beginning of that whole kind of final act is a single slow zoom shot that looks like a helicopter shot and comes all the way into the train speeding across the bridge and ends up with Vanessa Redgrave right in the middle of the picture. It's a really, really good shot. And I think it's interesting reviewing it now, and I think it's good that we've given it a bit of time because, yes, it kicked off the series, but also there's an awful lot in it, actually. It satisfies the action fans. From what Simon was saying, pretty good in terms of, getting close to the spirit of the original. But it also brings something new and something, 1990s, if there is such a thing, that, as you were saying, kind of paving the way to what was going to come later.
Yeah, and I just want to say also the fact that the fight on top of the train actually felt like, what a fight on the top of the train would be like, because they couldn't run. They literally just let go and fly because the train was going so fast.
Absolutely.
Because that's always been the one thing about, fights on trains is that they're usually like steam engines or sort of older trains, so that you can walk and, you don't have to worry about, just the fact that inertia would just sweep you off your feet.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Actually, as a side point, I think you could do an entire podcast about fights on the train.
There you go.
It'd be so cool because then you've got stuff like the ones we talked about. You've got the whole Bond films that would take up probably half of the podcast.
Yes.
But you've got all kinds of stuff. You've got the Cassandra Crossing and all kinds of things. But anyway,
Silver Streak.
Silver Streak. Yeah.
That was spooky. I think you were reading my mind there. I was actually thinking about that as well. But anyway, we should move on to the future and the turn of the millennium and get on to MI2.
Yes, yeah, right.
MI2 by Mr. Wu.
Yes, exactly. We went. Well, okay. Here's something that I think Tom Cruise has done, which is really smart. I mean, I'll start by saying I really like Tom Cruise. I know sometimes he gets some bad press by some people, but for what he does as an actor and a film producer and a guy who's passionate about his work, I really don't think you can fault him because, he thinks of his audience. He bothers with the fans whenever there's a premiere or whatever. He's always got the audience in mind when he makes something. And, he's got, apart from this franchise, he's now produced over 20 films, most of which have been hugely successful. But the one thing he doesn't do, which I'm quite surprised, because when you think about it, he spent the last 30 plus years on film sets and has a lot of experience. But he seems to know where his place is as a sort of leading man actor who does a lot of his own stunts, which we'll come on to, but also as a producer that gets involved in all the aspects of the production, but chooses not to actually direct it. Instead, he's very smart because I think the choices he makes of his directors, going for directors that have a very unique style and vision, to make each film within the franchise feel very different. And it's weird because he's almost sort of taken on like we talk a lot about television. He almost has kind of a showrunner role, but in movies, if you like. And but my hat. I mean, he's got the best job in the world. I think I really do, and you can see that he loves it, and you can see that he puts 100% into everything that he does and is so involved and works on it. So, Mr. Cruise, we do salute you and we do thank you for these films because, I think he's really smart with what he does. And obviously he made a big sort of gambling choice here to make his first ever sequel at the time. Very, very different to the first film. Would you say that's a fair comment?
I think it is, and I think your point about the directorial choices is an interesting one, because again, for me, and obviously we haven't seen the sixth one yet, we should say. For me, the differences in the directors are far more distinct in those first three films than they are in the following three. And again, that's not a criticism. I think it was certainly an interesting choice in terms of John Woo. I mean, at the time, this was 3 years after Face Off, which I enjoyed. But again, it's quite another interesting example of a film that is utterly nonsensical, of course, in any reasonable view, but is incredibly enjoyable. Although, interestingly, also, it's another one that's slightly died into the background now. It doesn't get an awful lot of play, and it's not really referred to that much, which is kind of interesting. And actually, it's particularly interesting in the light of John Woo going on to direct a Mission Impossible film about disguises and face changing. So that's kind of interesting in itself. Yeah. But also, I think for me, far more strongly in my memory than Mission Impossible 2, because, strange to say, I almost certainly saw it in the pictures, but I have very, very vague memories of it. And again, curiously, one that doesn't seem to get shown that much on that TV thing, which for me is still a useful tool to catch up on things. But just getting back to the point, Face Off was definitely one that I saw and enjoyed. But I also enjoyed John Woo's Hard Boiled, which was, I think, his first, not a Hollywood film as such, but it was the first one that really got seen in the West. And that also was about, shall we say, differing identities and disguising identities. And I can see where the kind of logic came into it. I'm not sure that it was necessarily a good fit to the franchise, despite the fact that I just said I don't really remember much of it. But I think that actually speaks quite a lot, actually, as to my view on whether it worked or not.
Now, I know this film quite well because I was working in a cinema at the time. Because this was the summer of bad films. This was the summer where we got The Patriot and Thomas the Tank Engine, and
I'm not sure you're entirely comparing like with like there, Simon.
No, but that was the summer.
I see the way you're going.
That was the summer. I mean, it started off really well. We got Gladiator. Great film to start off the summer, and it just went downhill. I mean, it was the year we got the first X-Men film, which to me, I didn't really enjoy.
Oh, anyway, that's a whole other podcast. And
sort of the end of summer season, we got Snatch, which was, at the time I hated, because I loved A Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, because that came out of another bad summer, and it was such a breath of fresh air amongst Godzilla and those kind of films, so Lost in Space.
So for you, did Mr. Woo woo you then?
No, which is a shame really, because at the time I was a big John Woo fan. I loved his Hong Kong stuff. The thing that brought him to attention in the West was actually The Killer.
Right.
And A Better Tomorrow. Hard Boiled was his last Hong Kong film before moving over to the States. Now, the States never really knew what to do with him. Hard Target was a lot of fun. And Face Off was probably the closest thing he did over in the States that was close to his Hong Kong work. But then Mission Impossible 2 was kind of like the sort of down point for him. He never really made a good film after Face Off. I always felt that was too much interference, or that the films that he was getting were not a fit really. Now, Mission Impossible 2, I think, kind of starts off with a fuck you with the mask stuff, because it's the bad guy pretending to be Ethan Hunt, and I know they use it a couple of times within the film, but I always felt like it was a bit of a oh fuck the mask stuff, let's this is more about the action and the ballet, the whole stuff with the motorbikes and the knives and
and I think for me that's interesting, because as I said earlier, I think And it is quite interesting when you see these films first time round, because your appreciation and your perception of them, is affected by when you see it then, and then you look back on it later. So it's different from when you come to them in one go. If you had to watch something new, all rushed together. And I think for me, that's probably why, whether I kind of got or had a link to the original MI series or not, that first film did set the tone, notwithstanding that scene in the lift at the beginning, as we discussed. To a pretty much, yes, action certainly, but not bang bang type gunfight action. Yeah. And I think for me, it's really interesting how it absolutely changes. And actually, looking back on it now, it's clear that it actually changes with Mission Impossible 2, because I think you're right, Simon. I think, funnily enough, the note that I've scribbled to myself here is, despite quite liking all that two-gun business in the Hong Kong films, particularly Hard Boiled, it actually looks a bit, when you match it to the bike clash and all of that and the slow-mo, it looks a bit parodic, really, for Mission Impossible.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of comical. I mean, the whole sort of dove motif that John Woo loves doing in his films, in this just seemed to just come at a very comical part,
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, somebody asked me the other day, I've revisited all the Mission Impossible films in the last couple of weeks as a lead up to seeing Fallout tomorrow. So, but somebody asked me about Mission Impossible 2 and said, do you think Mission Impossible 2 is a good movie or a shit movie, or what do you think? And my answer to them was this. I think Mission Impossible 2 is not a good Mission Impossible movie. However, it is a really good John Woo action movie starring Tom Cruise.
No, there's not even a very good John Woo film. I
disagree.
I mean, the Hong Kong stuff is amazing because it works on so many different levels. You get the spectacle of the action and the sort of the ballet of the gunplay, but you get the emotional side as well. You're dealing with an undercover cop and a sort of Dirty Harry type cop trying to sort of stay out of each other's way in some sense, and they both have guilt on their side, because in the very opening scene of Hard Boiled, Tequila, our main guy, he kills another cop, he kills an undercover cop, and he has to live with that. In Mission Impossible 2, you get this disease, this genetically designed disease called the Chimera, and this professor friend of Tom Cruise, of Ethan Hunt's, is trying to escape with it, and gets killed off by the bad IMF agent, and then it's just I don't know, it feels more like a Bond film than anything. Well, I mean, you've got the whole scene in the race course and stuff.
This is the point of exactly. This is the point I was trying to come to. Basically, I told them that I didn't think it was necessarily a good Mission Impossible film, because it is probably the most removed from the source material of any of them. Anything they've done, what they did before, and anything they've done since. And it's interesting what Chris said about the whole gunplay thing, because in the first film, other than Ethan grabbing the gun when Claire comes back to the safe house and sort of jumping around the room, pointing the gun at her, saying, who are you, and all this sort of thing, right? He doesn't use a gun at all in that film, whereas in this film he fires off so many rounds of ammunition, it's nobody's business, like you said, with all the Woo tropes of jumping through the air in slow motion with twin guns with a ball of fire and doves flying around, and all that stuff.
What else is funny is the fact that in the film they actually point out that Ethan Hunt doesn't like killing people.
Well,
when they talk about the raid on the main headquarters, where the lab where they have this Chimera, And they also, do Scott's characters go, well, he's going to come in through the top because he's not going to kill anybody. He'll want to come in and, as if nobody knew he was there. And then just the fact that after that, he kills everyone.
Yeah. But I mean, it is a totally preposterous film in terms of, what they've done is they've got, as the MacGuffin, they've got this, chemical warfare threat thing going on, and then they take the plot of Alfred Hitchcock's Notorious, okay, and
yes.
whack it in with a John Woo action tropes, and you were saying about the James Bond thing. I mean, I think this is where this first happened. Is, if you ask me, what's happened with the Mission Impossible franchise is it's become Paramount's answer to the Bond franchise. So obviously Sony's got the Bond films and Universal have got the Jason Bourne films and whatever. And this has sort of become, Paramount's answer to Bond, because, and the other thing that's you say about him, saying that he doesn't kill people and then killing loads of people. My problem with this, if I had one really, was the fact that Ethan Hunt in this film is a completely different character to what he was in the first film and the following films. This one is, it's not just, yes, he's played and voiced by Tom Cruise, obviously, but apart from growing his hair out, that's not where the changes end. I mean, everything from his motivations to his wardrobe to absolutely everything is much more of a Lothario Bond type act, Bond type character here. And I mean, the whole thing with the masks, that do link it to the franchise, is in the first film, it was very set up at the beginning, with the homage they did to the series about the face mask, and then it pays off at the end with a reveal. They earned it, right? In this one, it's ridiculous because we're supposed to believe that he went onto that island with a backpack full of masks and wigs of not only himself, but all of the bad guys that you might encounter. And I mean, it's ridiculous,
We should leave that perhaps on the big cliff in the desert that it starts on, and move on. But I think it's interesting to note, and I will say these without further comment. The screenwriter of this delightful film that we're enjoying was no less than Robert Towne, who had actually co-written the first film with David Koepp, which actually is interesting because Koepp was the kind of go-to screenwriter in that period.
He was,
all kinds of stuff. Robert Towne needs no introduction or bigging up from me or anyone else. And it's interesting because I have to say the one thing we haven't talked about, and I'm not suggesting we go back, is the dialogue or any of that in that first film, and certainly not in the second one. So that's kind of interesting in itself. But I think the thing I did want to end on, and I am reading this from Wikipedia, so you can read into that what you like, but it summarises the critical response to Mission Impossible 2 as mixed, and says that such criticism as there was tended to centre on the plot, the dialogue, the lack of resemblance to the source material, and the overall lack of substance. So I think that's quite a useful summary. I'm not saying we necessarily entirely agree with it, but it seems like it might be a good place to move on to the third one.
Yeah, I mean, Ron Moore and Brannon Braga were also involved in the story part of this. Obviously, their background being Star Trek, yet another Star Trek connection. But I do think, though, for all it, I mean, it's got some great action scenes. Anthony Hopkins, who unfortunately doesn't appear again, but he does have, I would say, probably the best line of the franchise, and that's where Tom Cruise says, he goes, getting her out, getting her in this situation and getting her out is going to be difficult. And he said, difficult? And he goes, yes, very. And he goes, well, he says, Mr. Hunt, this is Mission Impossible, not Mission Difficult. So difficult should be a walk in the park. And I have to say, cheesy as that is, it did make me laugh that they got the name check in there.
Yeah, yeah. It's a shame they didn't keep Anthony Hopkins on these films, because I think he played a very good boss. But I imagine that the cost of Anthony Hopkins is quite high.
Indeed, and obviously, you know, Tandy Newton. You know, I watched this and I'd forgotten how, you know, beautiful she was. Well, she still is, but in this film, you know, I was like, oh my lord, you know. But she, you know, it did good for her sort of Hollywood career. You know, and she's still going strong today, I'm pleased to say, seeing her in things like Westworld with Anthony Hopkins. So,
yes, there you go.
Again, it's all connected. If only we were part of it.
Talking of good careers then, that's a good introduction to Mission Impossible 3, 2006.
Yes.
J.J. Abrams, who had a very good career for a few years before that. You mentioned Alias. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Which you know is interesting given the origin of the entire concept. But you hinted at that with the reference to Alias earlier, and that was obviously a good call there. Lost was partway through its immensely long run. I'd parted company from it by then, but nevertheless, it was still going on. And I think for me, this is interesting because although, as we discussed at the beginning, absolutely remember the first MI film. For me, the one that really sticks in my mind, strange enough, more even than the most recent one, is Mission Impossible 3. And that may be because, I mean, I think I probably would have seen it anyway, just because I like action films. I was obviously well aware of Abrams' work, because, as I say, I used to watch Lost and used to watch Alias. And I probably was suckered in by some of the trailers as well. But for me, I thought this was actually, and it's interesting what you said, Keith, earlier about how you felt that the Cruise character was very different, atypically different in number 2, and kind of went back to normal in 3. I think in terms of the film and the whole MI concept, at least as far as I understood it, you know, not coming to it from the TV, what I liked about 3 was that it felt really, really different, and it felt much harder edged to me. Again, notwithstanding that opening scene of the first film, which was 10 years old by that point. If you think about the pre-credit sequence of MI3, with what's basically a psychological torture scene, with Tom Cruise's character as the victim, his girlfriend as the other victim, and a really good villain who you really feel is villainous. And that's before you get the Lalo Schifrin theme music. So, you know, for me, it felt really different from the start, and it continued that theme as it went on.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, Cruise went to Abrams because obviously Cruise is a fan of Alias as well. And, you know, that's the thing. Cruise, I think, as I said earlier, he is such a movie and TV fanboy, as well as actually being the guy who's in and doing all this stuff. You know, he clearly watches a lot. And that opening, that sort of pre-credit sequence, if you like, where they sort of pick up 2/3 of the way through the film, and then obviously afterwards sort of go back, you know, several weeks earlier or whatever it is. That was a trope that they used to use in Alias all the time. I mean, so many Alias episodes started off like that, right in the sort of heart of, you know, Sydney getting tortured or something, and or about to die, and then, you know, you have your little Alias credit sting, and then it comes back to you know, 2 days earlier or something, and we get to that point by the third act of the story. And you know, he essentially did that here. And obviously, you know, these directors that Tom hires, they always bring their kind of team with them, their creative team. So of course you've got Kurtzman and Archie as the writers on this with JJ. You've got Michael Giacchino coming in to do the music. He not only does Lalo Schifrin's opening theme, but he also does some of the other themes that were used in the TV series as well. He redoes those, which I thought was great. And, he brings a lot of his actors that he's worked with and his, production designers and all that sort of stuff on board. But from a story perspective, this is actually kind of a retread of the two films that came before. Because when you think about it, this one involves one of Ethan's friends in the IMF turning out to be a traitor, a la Jim Phelps in the first film, and the MacGuffin in it is a chemical weapon device that they have to steal and give to the bad guy. Yeah, which again is kind of what happened in the other films. So even though it's a completely different spin on it all, it does have some sort of familiar tropes in terms of the plotting of this.
For me, this is my favourite Mission Impossible film. And
we're supposed to wait to the end for that.
Yeah, well,
okay.
Sod it.
Spoilers.
But the reason why is because there's real stakes in this. I mean, in the second one, they try to do stakes halfway through where Fandy Newton's character injects herself with the disease, and so then Ethan Hunt has to find a cure. But in this one, the stakes are really high, and you can feel them, and that is because you have a hell of a bad guy with Philip Seymour Hoffman. I mean,
absolutely.
He plays an evil bastard. I mean, a right proper. You don't want to cross this guy. So when they lose him on the bridge, your heart just sinks because this is where this is leading, as we just talked about the opening sequence, and the fact that, spoiler, you see the death of his fiancée. You see the person he loves dying in front of him. Of course, that turns out to be a twist, but at that point, you're like, fucking hell. You're like, the gloves are off, really. It's a really weird experience to see that opening sequence the first time and then sit through the Mission Impossible song. You're like shit, and it's like dun, 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 and you're like, this is not appropriate.
No, and I think you're right, Simon, because for me, again, I have a really strong memory of this, and it was, it's only 10 years ago, but and like I keep saying, I come at this from a slightly different angle, and I think that's why this discussion has been so interesting, because much as I do like character and plot, for me, my response to the MI films, particularly the later ones, has mostly been around the action sequences, because that is one of the things I like, and particularly the types of action sequences that they've now started to do.
Yeah.
So for me, that's kind of how I come to it. But I completely agree with you because, again, that is one of my, apart from the action scenes, and I have to say that bridge attack scene is absolutely fantastic. I've always been a really big fan. This is very niche and very nerdy, but I've always been, because I'm quite into military stuff and military history and technology, as certain other guests of this podcast know, I've always really liked it when they do that kind of, not just, a car chase, but you have to get a Harrier jump jet or you have to get a helicopter or something like that. So that, I remember, again, really clearly watching that scene on the bridge where there's just a nice chat in the car, very standard sort of shot, and suddenly the car behind gets blown up. And it's still one of the best action sequences that I've seen in recent years. It was one of the first, possibly even the first films that I'm aware of to feature a drone. That admittedly he fends it off rather improbably with a assault rifle, but never mind. That's now become a bit of a trope in a lot of films because, again, it's very much a link to real world, and we kind of touched on that earlier. But getting back to that opening sequence, I completely agree. I think it was, you're right, there was a slight jar there where it jumps into the kind of the MI idea, but I think that's where that issue of the stakes come from, because it would be interesting to see it now. We've been talking about it, but my memory of it is that it's very, very, very simply shot. It's just basically, 3 facial close-ups that just keep hooking backwards and forwards. And say what you like about Tom Cruise as an actor, I think that's one of the best acting sequences that he's done, certainly in the MI franchise.
I agree.
And I think you're right. You really do get that there is really bloody serious stakes here, and you actually believe it. Whereas most of these, you know, particularly in a Bond film, I was going to say even in a Bond film, but actually, let's be fair, particularly in a Bond film, certainly the ones at that period, pre-Casino Royale, you never really get any sense of dread or you know, real stakes there. Yeah. But you definitely do in that. And I thought, for me, that was a real difference in the franchise.
Yeah, I mean, the whole bridge sequence works because at the end of the day, you just don't want Philip Seymour Hoffman's character to escape. And so you're there with Ethan Hunt trying to stop him. And, you know, that explosion that knocks him into the car, I mean, that looked properly nasty. I mean, you know, I'm sure they did it very safely, and if that had happened in real life, he'd probably be paralysed from the waist down. But, but you know, it did look like he actually hurt.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with you both. I mean, you know, this film thoroughly enjoyable, really well done. I mean, I have to say, what a loss to the absolute planet that we haven't got Philip Seymour Hoffman as an actor anymore, because you know, he is probably by far the strongest antagonist that we've had so far in the franchise, I think. And the other thing that I loved about what this film did, because I do think in some respects it did a little bit of course correcting, and I agreed with your point earlier, Chris, about how the first three movies really felt very different to one another, because they were kind of all sort of individual stories done in an individual auteur's or, you know, director's style, where, you know, what this one sets up and carries on in the remaining films is kind of a you know, more serialized fashion moving forward. So we've got plot points that start to sort of, and characters that sort of start to go through the other movies, as well as just the Ethan Hunt and Luther character. But one of the things they did really well, I think, in this film as well, which they didn't do at all well in the second one, was they actually gave some explanation as to how the whole masks and the voice chips and all that sort of thing work. And I thought JJ did that in a really clever way by having that very sort of tense scene where, you know, Hunt goes to, you know, replace Philip Seymour Hoffman's character, but they haven't quite got the voice part figured out yet, and he has to sort of tell the security guard to hold on a second and whatever. And I thought that's so JJ to sort of, you know, take what doesn't make sense and try and sort of retrofit it so it makes perfect sense. Yeah. And you know, he did that great. And also, of course, this is the only film, which again is a real IMF trope from the original series that they've never really got right in the films, is, you know, in the original series, you'd have the recording that would self-destruct on whatever it was, and then you'd have what they call the dossier scene, right? Which is obviously, it was a very analog time when this was done compared to today. But he would essentially go through that dossier and pick his team. And like I already said, the cool thing with the way BBC used to transmit it was a different team each week, you know. But he would pick his team, whereas in a lot of the movies, the team already gets picked for Hunt before he begins, which is why we have traitors and stuff in there. But at least in this one, he picks his team again. So again, I felt that this one was a much, much better homage to the original TV series than the two previous movies in many respects, you know?
Yeah. I like to give a shout out for a couple of things which I can they're very different, but they occur together, so I can cover both. We talked about the action sequences. I think we should mention the early action sequence, which is a kind of combination of shootout in the warehouse and that amazing helicopter chase through a wind farm, which is a really, really good example of an entirely original chase. Yes, we've seen aerial chases before, but a bit like car chases, they're actually quite hard to do either convincingly or in an original way. And again, I remember thinking that was genuinely unusual. I mean, it was great to do it at night. It was good to do it, as I say, in the concept of flying 2 helicopters through a wind farm. Again, as utterly impossible and incredible as the Channel Tunnel sequence in the first film, but it works brilliantly in the film.
Yeah, and what is so incredible, to add to that, Chris, also, and this is where, JJ and his team are so good, is the fact that you've got this countdown to this thing that's going to explode in her head happening at the same time. That's amazing.
And that links perfectly to the final point that I was going to make, which is I think we need to give a shout out to Kerry Russell, because I remember if having Philip Seymour Hoffman in there, really umps up the bad guy, having her there as admittedly a character who, spoiler alert, doesn't make it that far into the film, really, really helps, because, again, my memory very strongly of seeing her in that helicopter, knowing she's going to die and pleading for him to save her, and it doesn't work, it really got me, because she's a bloody good actress, and it really worked well in what is basically, a relatively minor role in that sense. So I just wanted to mention that because I think that's important.
Yeah, which JJ being loyal to his past collaborators again, which that guy always is, which I applaud him for. And my one criticism, if there was any, is that Maggie Q was probably a bit underused in this, really. But hey, she got the Nikita series pretty much off the back of this, so I guess it did something right. Yeah.
Yeah. Before we move on, I just want to say one thing. I think out of all the sort of people who have had to try and play Tom Cruise in disguise, Ethan Hunt in disguise, I think Philip Seymour Hoffman does it the most convincingly.
I agree.
Because you do believe that is actually Ethan Hunt in disguise. You don't... That has always sort of been the slight conceit in the whole Mission Impossible TV series and films, is that you believe that the person who's been impersonated is actually that person. But to actually have an actor who's pretending to be their character but being played by somebody else is a long stretch, and I think Philip Seymour Hoffman does it really well. You do believe that it's, Tom Cruise is hiding underneath the Philip Seymour Hoffman mask there.
I agree.
I think that's a really nice point.
Yeah, I agree.
And just as a minor factoid, I met Philip Seymour Hoffman's brother once, very, very, very briefly at the BFI. But yeah, no, it's good that you mentioned that. I think that's important.
Yeah. Well, they certainly did that a lot more successfully than in the second film with the whole Dougray Scott's character posing as Tom.
Well, yeah, that is the thing, because everybody's pretending to be Ethan Hunt in that film.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, even when they don't want to be.
I am pretending to be me, so I am going to say that. Interestingly, and I think Keith, you made a really interesting point there about a kind of one of the divisions between, as you can see it, between 1, 2, and 3, and 4 and 5, and I think we can fairly safely intuit 6 as well. And I think that's right. And I think there are other sort of differences as well in terms of the way it goes forward. We've talked about the directors. We've talked about your point about the move from the sort of auteur style to a kind of serialized approach. And I think it's one of the things for me that slightly has taken a slight edge away from the latter films is that in each of them so far, and I can't speak for the last one, the new one, but certainly the previous 2, we're into the kind of going rogue with no backup line, which, it is interesting, and we'll talk about that now in terms of Ghost Protocol from 2011, but it's interesting that is, I think, a definite kind of shift for good or bad in the series. And I think for me, I have to say it was for bad, because I saw this when it came out again. I saw it on an IMAX screen, and this has elements shot in proper IMAX, 15 per 70mm IMAX. I think it was perhaps slightly unfortunate that from memory, the trailer for the film, well, it wasn't really, I suppose it was a trailer, it was a clip, was from the Dark Knight film, the one which was also shot in IMAX with the two planes catching
Dark Knight Rises. Yeah.
Thank you. Which was absolutely mind-blowing, and it blew anything in Mission Impossible off of the screen, unfortunately, which it was really unfortunate. And I think it was interesting because I probably would have seen Ghost Protocol anyway, but I definitely was interested because it did have these IMAX sequences, and I thought, okay, that's definitely worth seeing. But despite that, for me, and I'll jump in and sort of start at a low point, it really didn't work for me. And I think one of the reasons was, strangely enough, this idea, as the poster had it, of no plan, no backup, no choice. Well, yeah, but I was never particularly convinced. And I think it doesn't help when you say we've got no plan and no backup and all that, and then suddenly you have a brilliant secret hideaway full of face-changing equipment and guns and all the other kind of stuff you need to actually have a backup and a plan. So,
well, I just want to say something though, Chris. The very first film was Ethan Hunt going rogue. I think more rogue because he didn't have that kind of backup, did he? He didn't have the devices and stuff. He had to. It was more about his wits than.
No, I think that's a fair point, actually, and you're right to point that out. But again, it may be that because of the fact that, well, okay, maybe not the second one, but the first two, 1 and 3, are pretty strong, and they've got their strengths in other ways, and it takes it into a different direction. I think it's interesting. I must admit, I'll be completely honest, I hadn't realised that. I'd forgotten that, and yet. Again, I definitely remember that, and maybe it's because one did it so well, because it was partly because of the way it was made and the time it was made, but it was definitely a more stripped back film than something like 3 and certainly 4. When you're hanging off of the side of the world's tallest building for real, I think you can say that you really are going to another level.
Yes, I think what happens here is that with this one onwards, it becomes more about spectacle.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely right.
I mean, I think it's safe to say we could talk about both films together because they are very similar. I mean, the fact that you've got him hanging off the tallest building, and then in the next one, you've got him hanging off the side of a plane for real.
I was going to say, both done for
and it does. These films do kind of make it feel more like a stunt reel for Tom Cruise.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I do like about this in terms of with the MI films and with the Bond films. We have kind of real action and real stunts and sort of death-defying stuff done for real, but obviously enhanced with some CG imagery to remove cables, etc., etc. Whereas another big action franchise that I love too is the Fast and Furious ones, but that's becoming more and more of a visual effects fest. To show the action, even though I know they do a lot of stuff as well. But your thing about the whole going rogue and whatever, I mean, this is one of the biggest differences, I guess, between the TV series and the movies. Is in the TV series, the IMF division, they would go in, they would do their mission, and they would leave, and they would have solved whatever it needed to be and move on, and nobody was kind of the wiser, but they'd fix that situation and were totally covert and all this. Whereas in the movies, the IMF team is just absolutely full of traitors and people going rogue. I mean, it's like a absolute awful.
If you look up under the yellow pages under sort of covert action force, don't call the IMF because they're probably the worst choice you could actually make.
Exactly. I mean, if there's one difference between analog and digital, it's that, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, the fact they blow up the Kremlin. I mean, they they destroy this historical building for the whole world to see. I mean, I'm surprised, that they haven't been closed down by now. It's like, well, everybody knows you're there now. It's not a big secret.
I think it's really interesting that we've kind of come to this view independently, and it's you know, we should say to the listeners that there was no collusion involved in this show at all. We didn't even talk about it beforehand, really. But I think it is interesting because I think Simon nails it there in terms of, you know, it's become spectacle over other elements, shall we say. Yeah. Although I think we should say that literally hidden behind the windows of the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, is actually the core of a really neat scene where they do the misleading in as to which hotel room the different parties are in, which is actually really clever and is absolutely in line with the TV franchise. Actually, if you divorced that as a concept and did it, you know, 100 stories lower down with a bit less spectacle, it will be really good to actually see a more kind of stripped back riff on that, because actually it's brilliant. It's really clever. But I think the problem is, for me, you know, it's really hard to sort of admire that as a neat intellectual conceit with a bit of wit to it when your main star is having to clomp down the side of the building 100 stories up and avoid getting blown off. So, and it's really strange because and anyone who knows me and my interest in films knows that I absolutely love IMAX, proper IMAX, and would see almost anything in it. I remember being bitterly disappointed at those Burj Khalifa scenes. And
really?
Yeah, and I'll tell you why. Again, nerdy interlude. I think it's a couple of things. I think it doesn't help that sequence that we talked about segues into a car chase and a running chase out of the building, but it all takes place in a sandstorm. So as I found with Christopher Nolan's Interstellar, Nolan, a brilliant supporter of IMAX in the Dark Knight franchise, completely throws it away in Interstellar because the whole sodding film is set in space and it's in black and white. And so whether you shoot it on IMAX or an 8mm camera doesn't make a lot of difference. So I would suggest that if you've got an IMAX camera knocking around in a few thousand feet of film and you want to blow people away, don't hide everything you're shooting in a sandstorm, because blown up to the size of an IMAX screen, that doesn't really help.
Right, but surely the bit on the building looked good, didn't it? You see, you've made me feel a little better, actually. The reason I say this is I remember this was a Boxing Day film when this one came out. I mean, I know they're like the one we're talking, the one coming out tomorrow. You know, we're in the middle of the summer and all that at the moment. But I remember this particular year, I think it was 2011 when Ghost Protocol came out. It was a Boxing Day film, and I went to see it on Boxing Day, but I was at my parents', which are down on the south coast. And one of my big regrets was that I wasn't watching it on the IMAX screen, because obviously I'd seen the Dark Knight film on the IMAX screen and loved it, and thought to myself, oh, I want to be seeing these sequences in full IMAX.
Other opinions are available, obviously, and obviously we'll get Simon's take on it in a second. But I think for me, that was part of it. So partly it was perhaps just an unfortunate choice of, is this a good match of format to what I'm actually showing? And does it really show it in its best? The other thing is a slightly weird architectural thing. The reason New York looks so cool is because it's full of skyscrapers. You can immediately judge visually and aesthetically which ones are taller, which ones are thinner. There is a context that's similar. When you get the world's tallest building stuck in the middle of a desert, it doesn't actually matter that it's the world's tallest building. You can't tell whether the other few buildings around it are, you know, short, tall, whatever. It's just a big, long steel needle sticking there. And the scene that you're alluding to, Keith, where he's literally hanging out of the building, and as we all know, he literally did that with appropriate support. For me, it didn't work. And I remember this really clearly. There's a very explicit, probably more than one actually, down angle shot where they literally just craned the camera out the window and pointed it straight down. But again, the problem is there is no context around there. The Burj Khalifa sits in a little artificial green, tiny desert, you know, set of gardens in the middle of the desert. So it's not like you're looking past him and seeing, God, that's a New York taxi going by, you know, half a mile below. There's no context. There's no scale. It looks like a CGI image. And that's the deep irony of the whole thing. And I remember, I haven't made this up for this podcast, I remember this very clearly when I watched it at the time. It looked exactly like if you'd had hung him on a green screen and CGI'd the background in, because there wasn't enough detail in the existing landscape to actually bring that out. If you did that by hanging him off the top of the Freedom Tower, which is the new replacement for the World Trade Center, that would be a lot more impressive, because you would immediately know you were hanging over New York. Dubai and all of that isn't that well known to people. You know, we all have a mental image of what London looks like, and I'll talk about that when we talk about Rogue Nation. And we all have a mental image of what New York looks like because we've all seen a million films set there. For me, that was why it really didn't work. You know, other people will have a different view, and I'm sure it'd be really interesting to hear Simon's view, but that was my reaction to it, and that's why I was disappointed.
I find that interesting. Simon?
Well, I didn't watch this in IMAX. I just watched it at a normal cinema. I thought, you know, I mean, I'm trying to rack my brain about it, because the problem with this one and the next one, Rogue Nation, is that they kind of bleed into each other. And it's trying to sort of remember what happens in each one. I you know, at the time I thought that sequence was kind of interesting. I thought it was well done and everything. I mean, you had the malfunctioning glove, you know, that was making the ascent and descent, you know, tricky. And you know, it was a callback to Ethan Hunt's rock climbing at the beginning of the second film.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point.
Yeah, so, you know, I remember enjoying the film when I saw it, but when I went back to watch it again, I think it was up to once they leave Dubai, once they get out of that sandstorm, it loses the film loses it. I feel it drags. It's not as interesting or exciting as it is up to that point, and that's a shame. I think that's a shame.
I wouldn't disagree, and interestingly, the three words I wrote down first when I was thinking about this today was messy, flabby, and bitty. And they're not three little robots from a sci-fi film.
Yeah.
But I mean, the fight in the car park with the moving car park bits were going up and down and stuff like that. I don't even remember that. I just didn't find that interesting at all. It seemed really weird. I mean, I don't know if it's an actual place, if there is a car park with that kind of system, but it just felt like it was out of another film.
Yeah, I think it was one. I think it does exist, and it was a bit like the Bond producers do. It was one of those things where they were traveling around and they were saying, "Oh, it would be cool to do a scene in here," and, you know, sort of building it around the set pieces, fitting it to the story. And of course, we get the mission accomplished line. But here's the thing. I mean, you know, obviously by this point, JJ is actually co-producing with Tom Cruise, so you know, it's a part Bad Robot production. In fact, I was thinking of this. Three of the biggest franchises, you know, Mission Impossible, Star Trek, and you know, Star Wars. JJ is creatively involved in all of them. It's like, wow, okay, but that
might not be a good thing, actually.
Well, I mean, he couldn't direct this one because he was committed to doing
Star Trek.
Super 8.
Oh, was it Super 8?
Super 8 at this point.
Okay.
And so he gave, you know, Brad Bird a chance, and obviously this is Brad Bird's live action directorial debut. I mean, he'd obviously done great work with you know, animation. In fact, at the moment, Incredibles 2 is screening, which is an amazing animation film that he's directed. You know, he kind of sort of brought his very, very sort of flowing, fluid design to this. And one of the things I really liked in the film, this is the only one that's done it so far, but I loved it, is where they actually brought the light the fuse part into the actual plot. And there's something that explodes at the end of it, you know. So that was quite cool, because he says to Paula Patton's character, who's, by the way, she's great in this film as well. You know, he actually says to her, light the fuse, and she lights it, and then we go into the, you know, Mission Impossible music and the opening credits thing, and then of course at the end it blows up the tunnel that they were running through. And I sort of thought creatively that was a really nice idea to sort of put that thing in. And again, you've got great sequences, like all of that stuff in Dubai is very well done. So yeah, I thought this was a decent entry as well. It's quite interesting that you guys maybe don't think so.
It's funny because I think equally it's interesting to me hearing, you know, some of the different take on it. I think for me, the only thing that exploded was probably my patience at the end of it.
I thought it was a real shame because, you know, Brad Bird had made a great sort of superhero spy mashup with The Incredibles, the first one. I mean, you got that real sense of, like, you know, 60s spies films, especially with the islands that they go to and the whole design of that. So, you know, I guess I was expecting a lot more from Brad Bird's first live action film. And it does feel like he was, you know, managed. I think J.J. Abrams, it's got a lot of his trademarks there, even though, funny enough, J.J. Abrams is very good at mimicking other directors. I still don't know what the J.J. Abrams style is, really, apart from lens flares.
No, and I would completely agree with you on that, because I don't think there is a particular style. But then maybe because I'm not that struck on the Star Trek whatever you want to call it, reboot, rejuvenation. Partly because I was just never into Star Trek anyway, but also because I just don't think these films are any good. Funny, I saw In Darkness for the first time the other day, and I thought it was great.
Well, yeah, Into Darkness is fucking awful. I mean, I enjoyed the first and the third one. They're much better films. They're more enjoyable. But Into Darkness was a big misstep, especially when they were going on about the fact, oh no, he's not Khan, and then they went, oh yes, he is.
Yeah. We've got a whole podcast on that listeners can go back and listen to. So there you go.
But just to finish this on what are we on now? MI5. Four.
Yeah.
I think what's also quite interesting is that in the same way that I've forgotten clearly, wiped from my mind, much of MI2, even reading stuff online about MI4, and I'm still not remembering any of these bits. I mean, who remembered that Leah Seydoux is in it? I did.
Oh, I did. Yeah, she's.
I remember her in Inspector, and she's sadly wasted and abused Inspector. But again, that's perhaps another podcast. I was interested in Simon's point though about having a kind of smooth link into the most recent film, Rogue Nation. And sort of having them slightly blur into one. I think it's particularly interesting because for me, that's not the case, because having dissed quite firmly Ghost Protocol just now, I really, really love Rogue Nation. I think it's, well, I'm not allowed to say which one's my favourite, but let's just say it's up there near the top.
It's funny you say that, because I mean, they're talking of the blurring of the, you know, the point that you were saying about blurring the stories, and I was saying it's become more serialized. I mean, one of the things that this film does, of course, which goes into Rogue Nation, then is you know, we've got some new characters being introduced. You know, we've got Brent, played by Jeremy Renner, who was going to be, well, he was kind of initially, in fact, it's weird, he was the guy that for two franchises was kind of lined up as the guy that will maybe take over, and in both of them. You know, I think he's found his place as a supporting character, because obviously they sort of lined him up for the Bourne films with that one, and then the rumor was that if Tom Cruise wasn't going to do any more Mission Impossible films, that Brent would sort of take over as the head of the IMF team, which obviously hasn't happened. So, you know, they introduced him, but also I know Simon Pegg was introduced in the previous film as Benji, but we get him in this as actually part of in the field and part of the team. And in some respects, much to my annoyance slightly, replacing the Ving Rhames character that Luther, that had been, the only one apart from Tom Cruise to actually have been in every one of the films. So, I mean, what's your thoughts on this extended cast, as it were, turning it more into a team again, like the source material?
I wasn't too bothered. I think I've never been entirely convinced by the Benji character. I think, and that may again be because I didn't really know Simon Pegg from his comedy work or from his TV work. So for me, I kind of first knew him in this. And actually, it was interesting because I suppose it's not really on the side, actually, because you've asked a question. But having seen him subsequently in The World's End, I think it is, which I was really impressed with because he's very different in that. And I thought that was really good. But I've kind of grown to like him. And I think as we get into to Rogue Nation, I think he's far more foregrounded in the story there. And it's a bit more than just the kind of, backroom guy, which incidentally is another kind of J.J. Abrams alias thing, if you think of Marshall in that. So for me, that worked okay. And Ving Rhames, again, never been entirely convinced by him either. In fact, I don't think I've ever been convinced by him much in anything apart from Pulp Fiction, but there we are.
Yeah, I mean, I will put it this way. Simon Pegg, lucky guy. He's done very well with being good mates with JJ. Let's just put it that way, hasn't he? But yeah, I mean, I preferred him in 3 as the sort of, comedy relief sort of background character than necessarily being sort of one of the team. I mean, essentially, again, before this film, before they sort of expanded the team, it was very much that sort of Bond feeling thing where, Ethan Hunt was the central and the sort of main character and hero, and Luther and whoever else would be there would kind of be, the tech guy and the helicopter pilot kind of filling in a little bit like sort of Q and Felix Leiter from the Bond films. Whereas, from this film onwards, from, Ghost Protocol through, and I guess it's going to go into Fallout as well, is we've got much more of a recurring team thing happening where they tend to be in the field with Ethan as well. I mean, even the posters, all of the posters have always been posters of Tom Cruise's profile, essentially. But I've noticed the last couple of films have actually included other characters in the posters as well, which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, Simon, on the sort of bringing sort of Simon Pegg's Benji in as a field agent and sort of putting Luther more into the background? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, my thoughts on like the latter half of these films is that they found a formula that they feel works for them. So hence why, you have characters like Simon Pegg returning and sort of playing a bigger part, and Luther was the computer guy. He was the guy who did all the hacking. So now that you've got Simon Pegg there doing his stuff as well, doing that job, it seems a bit redundant to have the two of them. I think they have turned Luther into sort of moral support, really, but maybe in in Fallout he has a bigger part. Who knows?
We'll have to wait and see.
The thing I don't enjoy about these films now is that, as I say, they've gotten very formulaic. They, as you say, they're always going. Ethan Hunt and the team are always going rogue, and they don't have much backup. And there's always, traitors, and there's always a character who's gonna. You don't know where their loyalties are, but you do really. I miss the sort of having the director's stamp on the work. I mean, you could tell the difference between the Brian De Palma Mission Impossible and the John Woo Mission Impossible.
Yes.
But since Ghost Protocol, it's gotten very samey.
Well, I'm going to disagree there, if I may, because I think, and this again is why for me there's a definite line between Ghost Protocol and Rogue Nation. I think Christopher McQuarrie, again, who I wasn't particularly familiar with, really, really put a positive stamp on Rogue Nation for me. And yes, there are the action scenes, and we can talk about those. But it, again, as with the first film, and to me, there was quite a good link between this one and the first film, because you had a really good blend of really, again, unusual and interesting action scenes. But you also had the interest in location and atmosphere and character and kind of what you might call slow action. So yeah, you've got that opening sequence, as you were saying, Simon, hanging on the side of an A400 plane as it takes off, all done for real, which did look absolutely brilliant when you see it on the big screen, because you can see the sun hitting his face and you can see it's Tom Cruise. But you've also got that amazing opera house sequence, which is one of the best action, although there's not a huge amount of action in it, sequences that I've seen for a long time. And it's very old school. It's very clearly shot. You know, it's a really complex scene because you've got two different assassins and Tom Cruise and a victim in the middle of an opera house, all done in the middle of a performance. And
yeah, I love it.
Yeah, it works incredibly well. It's a really long scene. It's about 10, 15 minutes.
It was done so much better than what they tried to do in, Quantum of Solace, where they...
I was trying not to even mention that, but I was horrifically reminded of it as I said that. But you're absolutely right. And I think it was very old school. I gather, I may be wrong in this, but I gather there was a bit of Chinese finance in this, and it's been suggested that some of the atmospherics around what London looks like, because it's a very kind of Victorian London with a lot of fog and shadows and things, but again, not in a kind of cliched way, but just in a kind of traditional way. It's been suggested that there's a bit of a nod to them there about, giving them what they might expect. But I don't think that really matters if it's true, because for me, it's a really good balance between old school, again, that kind of European feel, a bit of the noir to it as well.
It had a bit of a Hitchcock feel to it. Again, definitely with the stuff at the opera had a real Hitchcockian feel to it. But also, you're absolutely right. I mean, these films, they absolutely have to appeal, to the Chinese audience and whatever. As well now, and obviously that kind of started off with the third film, and I agree they seem to be sort of doing those things that they want to see in these films as well, and in a good way, way.
And I think as with some of the other films, although not that many, but I think for me one of the big positives of this film, and again I think it differentiates it from the previous one, is having Rebecca Ferguson in it, because again she was a discovery for me. I'd not seen her in anything before. It's a kind of, again, a slightly old school look, because she's not a kind of typical sort of Hollywood glamour person, but she's incredibly attractive and really, really plays the part well. She's not just a sort of dolly bird and that. And obviously, as we were alluding to, they've carried on her, they've carried the director, they've carried the main villain as well through into the new film. And as Simon said, remains to be seen what that might look like. But I think I certainly see where you're coming from, Simon, on that issue of the sort of blending. I personally, I don't think it's quite as smooth as that. But as I think we all agree, there's a definite change, from that fourth film onwards. And yes. Whether that's good or bad, I guess, we'll have to wait and see.
Well, I mean, for me, I'm not a fan of it. I think it was the unique thing about this series of films was that you got the director's
stamp on it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, and I kind of miss that. I mean, as bad as Mission Impossible 2 is, it still, as we've said, feels like a John Woo film. They took risks. Now we know how to do it. We know how to make these films. We know... Because I enjoy Christopher McQuarrie's work. I mean, I enjoy Way of the Gun, which was his directorial debut, and I also liked. I'm trying to think of the film that came out before Rogue Nation with Tom that he'd done with Tom Cruise.
Jack Reacher.
I really enjoyed Jack Reacher. I'm a fan of the books, and even though Tom Cruise doesn't look anything at all like the character in the book. I mean, he's way too short. He doesn't look like a Marine. But, I really enjoyed that film. I thought the sequel to Jack Reacher was terrible.
It's Cruise's second franchise now. Obviously Mission Impossible being his first, and Jack Reacher. And Jack Reacher's kind of the anti-Ethan Hunt, isn't he?
Yes, very much so.
It's like, yeah.
The Jack Reacher stuff is a much more realistic portrayal of the man who comes into town and sorts the problems out. I mean, that's who that character is. He's like the Bruce Banner. He walks into town, he deals with whatever the problem is, and then he walks back out again.
Well, I think Simon identifies, just going back a little bit, I think Simon identifies a really important point, and Keith, you touched on it as well, that inevitably any big creative thing that isn't absolutely tied with one person, like, George R.R. Martin or something like that, is inevitably going to get the rough edges smoothed off, and the ambition and, the risk, I think you said, Simon, that just dies in the end. And I think, let's not even get started on Star Wars, but I think that would be a fairly simplistic argument, but it's certainly one that people have made, and I think, with a degree of logic to it. And I think on the one hand, you've got, I know we differ on it slightly, but I think for me, Macquarie does show a degree of individualism that I think I could live with. Again, it'd be really interesting. It's a bit like the Bond films, actually. If you think of the two that Mendes did, theoretically that would have worked, because, I really loved Skyfall. I thought it was brilliant, but I thought Spectre was dreadful. So it'd be really interesting to see what Macquarie does with this next one.
Yeah.
I think it sounds like Simon really likes, if you can't have a, quote, good MI film, then at least you can have a good film of that director. And I can certainly see the positive in that. And I can certainly see how, if you get a film that doesn't appeal to you on either of those fronts, you're going to struggle a bit. And I think that's a perfectly valid point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there has been a, Tom Cruise's initial intentions with this franchise was to have, every film in a completely different style, but using, the Ethan Hunt character and the Mission Impossible, trope and storyline and whatever. And, Christopher McQuarrie, he's not actually credited, but he did do some of the rewrite and some of the setup on Ghost Protocol. So, he has obviously the continuity, if you like, that's involved in the last, 3 films. It comes from that, because it's coming sort of from the same writer as well as the guy helming it. So and he's clearly got a relationship with Cruise, through other films that he's written and involved in, whether it's Edge of Tomorrow or Valkyrie, which I think is rather underrated personally.
Yeah. But also, he was the writer of The Mummy, and that was such a successful film.
Yeah.
You say that as though you're surprised.
Yeah, that was a not everything Cruise does is great, but but we have bigged him up a lot here. But I'm sorry, I'm conscious of time as well, because we're not going to complete our mission, are we? It's going to self-destruct. It's going to self-destruct. Yeah. Let me ask then one question. I mean, I've got a little thought on this, which probably will never happen. But who would you like to see direct a Mission Impossible movie?
I'm going to let you guys have the first.
Well, I had a little thought that in some respects, I know this is very unlikely to happen, but in some respects, I'd like to see Spielberg do one. And the reason I say that is Spielberg and Cruise have got a good relationship. They obviously did Minority Report and War of the Worlds together, and they work well together. Plus, one of the things that started the whole Indiana Jones series, I shouldn't say trilogy, sorry, series of films, is the fact that...
Actually, Keith, you're correct. It's a trilogy.
A trilogy,
we'll just forget the fourth film.
In my head, yeah. But, one of the reasons that started was because Spielberg, always wanted to direct a Bond movie. For me, the Mission Impossible films are are kind of, like I said, Paramount's answer to a sort of American James Bond. And I just wonder what Spielberg would bring to it, and whether or not that would be, how that would come out. But it was just a side thought that I had.
I think it's a fair one, and I think you could potentially posit people like David Fincher.
Well, he was attached to do the reason there was a long gap in the production between 2 and 3 was because Fincher was originally attached to do it, but he and Tom clashed with their ideas of where they wanted to take it. So Fincher and his crew his creative crew, which were already assembling, and even some cast, I think, that was attached. I believe Scarlett Johansson was attached at that point as well. They all kind of left, and then JJ retooled the whole thing.
I'm not saying it would necessarily work. I'm not saying he'd necessarily be a good fit for it. But you could. I mean, there are lots of people you could imagine. I mean, people. What about someone like Gareth Edwards? I think would actually be quite good. I would have said Denis Villeneuve, but then I went and saw Blade Runner 2049, so I'm going to withdraw that. And maybe there aren't that many women directors, of course, but maybe someone like Catherine Bigelow, although I rather suspect she'd think it's slightly below her nowadays. But
she'd do it really well.
She would do it very well.
Really good. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
And good that you think of female directors, which is important. So yeah, that's a good point.
So are we going to... I suppose you could take it in a slightly different direction. You could have someone like Shane Black, but then again, I might have agreed with that, but I'm not even liking the trailers for The Predators. So I think we'll move away from that.
Unless you want to see a Mission Impossible film set at Christmas.
Yeah. I've got a feeling we might be having a Predator podcast sometime in the future. I don't know why, but I have a feeling. There you go. But cool. All right.
Although we've sort of kind of been doing it as we've gone along, but just for completeness, do we have to rate or at least pick our best and worst of the MIs so far?
Yes, you got to pick your best and worst.
We are movie heaven, movie hell. So yes, and we usually let our guests go first.
Damn, I thought I was going to push that one onto you guys, but okay. I probably should do it in reverse order then, shouldn't I? So for the hell, and I'm slightly torn, I would go for Ghost Protocol for the reasons that I've stated, but also worryingly because I actually remember it and I still hate it. I would probably also go for MI2, but that's mainly because I don't remember much of it. I suspect if I watched it now, it might have a certain period charm, but I think it might be best left forgotten completely. So I think I'm going to go for Ghost Protocol as my hell. As my heaven, I suspect it would, much as I do love the first one, and I do, because it's one of those films that I've talked about telly a lot in terms of watching films on telly. You can keep all your video on demand and all your streaming and all of that. You can't beat coming across a film like that and thinking it's going to start in an hour and thinking you might just watch 10 minutes of it and you end up watching the rest of it. So much as I would like to go for the first one, I think I'm going to have to go for Rogue Nation because I really, really liked it. It would be interesting. I have seen it again since I saw it in the pictures and I still did like it. Again, you can never really capture that excitement of seeing something for the first time on the big screen. But I'm going to go with Rogue Nation as my heaven.
Okay. Simon?
Well, for me, my movie heaven is Mission Impossible 3, as I sort of stated earlier. No surprises. But for my hell, I'd actually go with Rogue Nation.
Oh gosh, really?
Yeah. This is the first film that I didn't see at the cinema.
I think it plays a big part.
I've seen all the rest at the cinema, apart from this one. I caught this on TV, and I must admit I wasn't that impressed. And the life of me, I cannot really remember much of what happens in this film. You know, even though it's the sort of probably the last one I've seen. You know, it's the most recent, and the life of me cannot remember much of what happens in this film. I can remember what happens in the first one, the second one, the third one, and even the fourth one. But this is why it's my hell. I think it's very... I don't remember much of what happens in this film. There's not much that stands out. I mean, there's all these sort of similar tropes.
No, I think that's fair, and I think particularly in light of how you described your sort of journey through them all, I think that's fair.
Mm.
So have I got this right, that your hell is Chris's heaven?
Yes.
Yeah. That'd be a fun pairing, wouldn't it? Maybe we could watch half of it each or something. I don't know.
Wow.
That's all right, okay. Chris. You can watch the whole thing. I don't mind.
Wow. Okay.
So come on in, Keith. Where do you stand on this?
Well, it's really tough because I absolutely love the entire series of them, and I can't wait to see the 6th one tomorrow. I'm hoping I'll be saying that 6 will be my heaven once I've seen it. But no, for me, movie hell is Mission Impossible 2, and I do say that with the caveat that it's the least Mission Impossible of all the films, although it's an incredibly entertaining, although ludicrous action film, and I actually love it as a film in its own right. But as part of the series, I would pick that as the worst one for me. And the heaven one is really hard because, I hear all your points, and I'm really loving these films, and I'm a big JJ fan as well, as I often mention. But I'm going to go for heaven. I'm going to go for the first film, and I think I think there's a lot of nostalgia that's playing into that for me. It's probably the one I've seen the most, and it was the film that came out the summer that I started film school in the US, so it was a really big deal for me at the time, and I loved it. And yes, they kind of betray the Jim Phelps character, which is problematic, but in terms of the style of the film, the continuation of the series from all the other aspects, I really love it. So I'm gonna choose Mission Impossible 1 as my heaven.
Well, I think that's really interesting, and I think you'll all be aware that there is this thing going around. I don't know what the word is. It's not a trope, and I'm pretty sure it's not a meme. But anyway, that says that the good ones are the odd-numbered ones, and the bad ones are the even-numbered ones. So it'll be really interesting, and that's quite a neat idea because it covers the 6th one either way, doesn't it?
It's the Star Trek rating system.
Yeah. I was just going to say that.
Well, it may have some legs because, for me, I absolutely agree with it because, as I think has been pretty clear from what I've said, for me, it's bang on. And I think, but just going back to Keith's choice, his heaven choice, it's probably fair to say that I don't think none of us would fight each other if someone suggested sitting down and watching the first one, would we? So that's probably a good kind of end point.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think this podcast is going to self-destruct in 5 seconds.
I'm just hoping you pressed save all the way along because otherwise it's really fun.
Yes, I do apologise to listeners if the audio quality from my side has not been so good on this film. We had a slight technical issue and I couldn't use my wonderful microphone that Pete Mealy gave me for this episode, but there you go, never mind.
What you actually mean is you're talking through a mask the whole time.
That's right, yeah, I've got my Tom Cruise mask on. Yeah, I live in hope.
I thought it was your J.J. Abrams one actually, but
my glasses.
No, you'll find it's J.J. Abrams who wears the masks.
Oh. Anyway, there you go. So loads more, we could delve into, but that's all for this one, I guess.
Yes. So, Chris, where can people find out more about yourself and your work? Do you have a website, social media?
Yeah, they can find me at www.chrismrogers.net. That's chrismrogers.net. Where there are a range of long-form articles and a blog page, which doesn't get updated as much as I'd like, but there's plenty of film-related stuff across that whole website. I'm also on LinkedIn as well, under my name, obviously. where you can find a summary of some of the things that I do, particularly in this sort of architectural field, which is my big thing. But yeah, that's me.
And you have a book, don't you?
I've contributed, my latest one I've contributed to, which is 30-Second Paris by Ivy Press, which is a book of essays looking at Paris in a slightly different light, different themes, different ideas. 30 seconds is all it takes to read each article. So it's quite a nice little package there. And you can still get my How to Read London and How to Read Paris, which are my own books, little architectural canters through 1,000 years of history of each city.
There you go, from all good booksellers.
Absolutely.
So, Keith, where can people find your work?
Yeah, you can, if you go to YouTube and put in British Eyles, that's Eyles, as in my last name, you can see some short films that I've made there. In terms of other work I've done, if you put my name into IMDb, you can see past, present, and future credits of things I'm working on there. And if you want to get in touch, you can do so through the podcast.
And as always, you can find my work at independentrunnings.com. You can listen to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, and all good podcast providers. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Just search Movie Heaven, Movie Hell. And please leave us a rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher. It all helps. So, that just leaves me now to thank Chris for coming on.
Thank you very much. I've really, really enjoyed it. So thank you for asking me.
And I hope you, the listener, join us for another episode of Movie Heaven, Movie Hell.
This podcast will self-destruct in 5 seconds.